Good evening, Governor, judges, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Kevin Walton. I'm the director of the Julius Stone Institute of Jurisprudence. I'm pleased that you could join us, whether in person or on Zoom, for this year's Julius Stone address. I'd like to start by inviting the Dean of the University of Sydney Law School, Professor Simon Bronitt, to give an acknowledgement of country.
Yini Kalawa Gan Mari Bidiri Gadi Nurida, which means in Gadigal language, we meet together on this beautiful country of the Gadi, the people who have had law and lived and cared for this beautiful country since time immemorial. And the Gadi, I'm delighted to say, they're looking over us. They're those three amazing spiky trees. And I should say that while our Indigenous garden, which we just planted recently, those plants are over 130 years old. So they are as old as our law school, which is a reminder that we are here now on lands that law has been discussed and debated for many eons, and look, many years. And I'm so honoured to be the dean of this amazing law school, and I just wish I had known Julius personally, but I've known him through his children and his grandchildren, particularly Adrian. We were colleagues in the 90s at ANU together. So I am absolutely delighted that we host this amazing event annually in honor of a towering figure of jurisprudence. That's enough from me. I've said more than I said I would to Kevin, but look, I'll hand back for the formal welcomes and introduction to our wonderful distinguished speaker, Professor Philip Pettit. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So the Julius Stone Institute of Jurisprudence, which was established in 1999, seeks to contribute to scholarship in legal theory broadly understood. That is, as Julius Stone understood it, at the University of Sydney and beyond. The Institute organises regular seminars and occasional conferences. It arranges about a dozen seminars each year and hopes to hold its next major conference in 2022. Members of the Institute teach legal theory to undergraduate and postgraduate students, including those in the Specialist Master of Jurisprudence programme. They also supervise PhD candidates in legal theory, whose work the Institute supports through the Rika Stone Scholarship, which is now available as a full scholarship for 3.5 years. In addition to the Rika Stone Scholarship for PhD students, the Institute will soon advertise a 1-year postdoctoral fellowship and a shorter professorial visiting fellowship. Before the end of the year, it will also award the Dennis Leslie Maney Prize in Legal Theory for the 4th time. The prize was last won by Professor Martin Krieger, who is, I'm pleased to say, in the audience this evening. Entries for this year's Maney Prize close on 30th of June. None of these activities would be possible without generous support from friends and family of Julius Stone. The Institute is grateful to them all, and I'm delighted that several members of his family are here this evening. Let's turn then to this evening's event, the Julius Stone Address, which has been made possible by generous funding from the Educational Heritage Foundation. The address did not take place last year, for obvious reasons. Fortunately, the speaker, Professor Philip Pettit, was willing to postpone his lecture to 2021. He will be introduced by Adrian Stone, who is Kathleen Fitzpatrick Australian Laureate Fellow, Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor and Director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies at Melbourne Law School. She's also Julius Stone's granddaughter. Thank you, Professor Stone.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's such an honour and a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker on account of his very great distinction, and also because I'm lucky enough to boast of him as a former colleague at the Australian National University. Philip Pettit is Elias Rockefeller University Professor of Human Values at Princeton and Distinguished Professor at the ANU. He is the author of a very large and immensely distinguished body of work across political philosophy, as well as the theory of mind and metaphysics. Among his recent work include books on group agency, the birth of ethics, and just freedom. He has given many lectures, including the Tanner lectures in human values, the Locke lectures, the Hart lecture and Wright lecture at the University of Toronto. And really, with great pleasure, as chair of the advisory board, but also on behalf of the Stone family, to say how delighted we are that you have immense distinction and your brilliant mind now to the Julius Stone lecture. So I'm very delighted to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, Kevin, Simon. And it's a real pleasure to be here and a great honor to be giving the Julius Stone lecture. A towering figure, as Simon described him, surely in the history of this department, but not just that of this faculty, also in the history of Australian jurisprudence and law. So I'm deeply honored, especially since I'm not legally qualified. I'm indeed unqualified to talk really to such a distinguished legal audience, but let me do my best, because after all, philosophy and political theory certainly overlap. Perhaps they should overlap even more with issues of concern to lawyers more generally and legal theorists. So I'm going to talk about popular sovereignty and how it connects with the history of the concept. It's somewhat esoteric as a topic. I'm very conscious of that. But I hope I can breathe a little life into these old bones of this concept. The reason I got interested, and there are many, but one reason certainly is that the notion of popular sovereignty has become such a common sort of trope in political argument nowadays. I mean, it's used basically in two ways, I think, in contemporary thinking. One is in giving a sort of really harmless gloss to what regular sorts of democracies like Australia is, constitutional democracies, as you might call them, where you say, well, in a constitutional democracy, the people are sovereign, and no one really looks very closely at what that means. But it also, within popular discourse more recently, has gained this very edgy usage in which popular sovereignty is invoked in favor of what really ought to be called electoralism, but is often called populism. And what I mean by electoralism is the view that really the only authorities who command authority, so to speak, in the public world are those who are elected. So that, for example, the judges, dear to your hearts, are, so to speak, they don't have the same authority. They should be pushed aside, but equally all statutory bodies and officials, and indeed also social movements. They're all unelected after all. And the new electoralism, which I think is associated really with autocratic theories of democracy and practices of democracy, suggests that it's really just the elected who have any authority. Who elected those, as someone has said, of the justices of the Supreme Court in the US, or might be said of the justices of the High Court in Australia. That's one of the reasons I think it's important we think about it. It's what exactly we mean by popular sovereignty, because it's a phrase everybody wants, but it's been captured in a way by this electoralist movement in democracy worldwide, really. But the notion of popular sovereignty lives a double life, because it's had a long life in the history of legal and political thought, philosophical thought about the nature of the state. So what I'd like to do, I hope it won't be terribly boring, it is a bit of an academic exercise, but then you're an academic audience in great part, is to look at the notion of popular sovereignty, important as it is in contemporary practice, from the point of view of the history of the notion of sovereignty and the role that it has been required to play and has played in the history of legal and political thought. So I've given a handout, which is not meant to be as well followed, but it may, in discussion, I hope we'll have discussion afterwards, help to remind you of the terrain I hope that I'll cover in the next 50 or 55 minutes, if you'll allow me that. So I'm going to talk first of all about the origin of the concept of sovereignty, then the problem raised for sovereignty by what I'm going to call polycentric regimes. And then I'm going to talk about whether or not you can have a sovereign in such a regime. And finally, I'm going to come back to what does that tell us about the notion of the people being sovereign, as in popular sovereignty. So let me begin with the history. It really goes back to a figure who looms large in the history of legal thought, a French lawyer, legal theorist, Jean Bodin, from the 16th century, lived from about 1530, if I remember, to 1590 something. And Bodin introduced this concept as part of a whole new rethinking of the nature of public law in general, I would say, and the nature of the state in particular. Just by way of background, Bodin is writing in the 1500s, as I said. Roman law was discovered late in the 11th century, basically beginning of the 1100s, rediscovered. I mean by Roman law here, the law that Justinian's law books had codified. Justinian, the Eastern Emperor, had had a committee set up basically to write up the wisdom of Roman law in the Digest and the Institutes. And those books, he was in Constantinople, that was written in Latin. Those books really were neglected and disappeared in the West and were rediscovered in, I think it was 1095. And Roman law really captures the imagination of people on the church side and on the secular side over the next 400 years. I mean, it's a long period. It's almost as long as the period between us and Bodin. And it captured the imagination and indeed the practice in this sense that while there were local laws, of course, and they varied, the interpretation of local laws, the criticism of local laws, the reshaping of them was often influenced by what was thought to be the sacrosanct law. In fact, they called it the common law, the jus commune, common as between the church and the state. And the church reorders its jurisdiction and its edicts in terms of Roman law, and then quickly so do the various states. The small states, but really important states of Italy at the time, some of them republics, some of them not republics, but also the larger states, like the states of Germany, and there are many of those, but Italy, France, Spain, and England. They all go in for this Roman law reconstruction of their legal systems. And it becomes important as a sort of lingua franca or a lex franca, as you might call it, in the sense that if there are disputes between, for example, the cities of Italy, the city-states of Italy, and the emperor, who has a certain status in relation to them under accepted sort of categories, it's often used as a way of negotiating those difficulties and resolving them. And everybody, pays obeisance to Roman law because it's a means by which they can agree, so to speak, on resolution. Because everybody, if one city can make out a case in Roman law against another, against the emperor, other cities are going to see that it's useful for them to have that as a weapon, so to speak, in their arsenal, and they go along. So Roman law gets an amazing sort of status. Now, Bodin is part of a group in the early 1500s who really begin to critique Roman law. And in particular, they do it on the basis of humanist scholarship, as it's often called, in the interpretative techniques that have been developed in the course of the Renaissance for interpreting classical texts. They bring that to bear on these legal texts. They're often called legal humanists. And what they come up with, so it's pretty quickly actually, is that it's a total mess. That Justinian's law books, represent sources from a long period of time, from many different places, from republican and empire sort of loci, and that there are actually inconsistencies within it in any case, and lots of principles ascribed to it that aren't there to be found in the law books. And on the basis of that critique, Bodin begins a whole rethinking of law. And that's where the concept, as you'll see in a moment, of sovereignty begins to enter. I just mentioned Bodin is the beginning of that tradition, a tradition that we might call sovereigntism. It's often called absolutism. But I think that in many ways that's a misleading term. They weren't really absolutists in the very objectionable, pejorative sense of the term, at least Bodin wasn't. But those who are also sovereigntists, in the sense I'll explain, include Hobbes, for example, the English theorist of the following century, of the 17th century, and of course Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century. We'll come briefly, I'll comment on those figures as we pass, but let's go back to Bodin and his rethinking of law. The way I read, he wrote the 6 books of the Republic in 1576, 4 years after Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where 10,000 Huguenots were literally slaughtered and massacred. So in a period of great religious strife, and that's certainly behind his way of thinking in the 6 books of the Commonwealth, which he publishes in 1576. Okay, here's the way he thinks about law, very simply. He says, first of all, law is command. If you have a law, you're given an instruction, it's a command that is given to people. So that's the first axiom, so to speak. Second axiom, no command without a commander, and in particular, one commander. That's the sort of second axiom. So law implies command, command implies commander, and then commander implies, and he derives 2 sort of aspects, or is it to be a commander? Well, first of all, you can't describe the commander behind the laws or the commands in any state and assume that there's someone to whom that commander is subject, someone whose permission the commander has to seek before issuing a command. Because if you did have someone to which the commander was subject in that sense, then that person would be the real commander. So that's the first sort of aspect of what's implied by commander, that the commander is subject to no one else. The second is, in a way, even more surprising, which is that the commander can't be subject to his or her or their or its, as we'll see, all appropriate, commands. Why? Because of a simple logical truth, which is that no one could give himself, herself, themselves a command. You can command another person, but you can't command yourself, because a command is taken to be the expression of a will by Bodin. And you can't, so to speak, command your own will. You can try to do it, but since you're the one, well, Hobbes actually summed up the reason why you can't do this 100 years later, rather briefly. He said, the problem is that he that binds can release. And if you can release from the bind or the bond, it is no bond at all. So this suggests now you get a notion of the commander who produces, and he calls the commander the sovereign. It's a word that had existed, souverain in French, but he introduces it as a word that becomes central in political legal thought over the next 400 or 500 years. This sovereign, he says, is above the law and above others, and this is a really quite a dramatic rethinking of what law is about. Hobbes takes that over, and Rousseau does, as we see, in different ways. That suggests that it is very absolutist. After all, it does suggest there is someone outside the law who creates the law, who isn't subject to the law, isn't subject to anybody else. It sounds like an absolutely potent, irresistible force that is recommended. But there are 3 qualifications I think you'll find in Bodin that are really important. He says the commander, the sovereign, can't be constrained, it's true. But he specifies the ways in which the sovereign can't be constrained. And I think there are 3 qualifications he puts on constraints that the commander must be free of. First of all, he often says he, though as we'll see, he is not always appropriate. Continue with that. He says the commander, the sovereign, is required not to be subject to enforced constraints by others. Constraints that others might impose on him, might penalize him for not actually going along with them. In that sense, it's an enforced constraint. There can be no enforced constraints of the sovereign, sovereign beyond all of that. But he says, of course, the sovereign is subject to the law of God and the law of justice. And he's quite clear that any decent sovereign, that's the word, decent sovereign, should obey the law of God. This is sort of natural law and fundamental laws. The laws of nations, which he thinks of in that sense as equally sort of morally binding. But of course, that's fine because no one enforces those. And he's quite clear. He says, even should a sovereign become a tyrant, in other words, not really behave well, he remains a sovereign. He's just a bad sovereign. That's the first really important qualification. So the sovereign is subject only to enforced constraints, not to unenforced constraints. The second qualification is that he's subject only to uncontracted constraints. As Bodin equally says, look, a sovereign could make a contract with another sovereign, for example, and maybe you have a third sovereign, the person for the moment, enforcing that contract, imposing the sanction that anyone breaking the terms of the contract would deserve under the contract. And he says, that's fine. Sovereigns can be bound by contract, but they can't be bound by uncontracted constraints of the economy. The third qualification is, he says, he doesn't actually say this, and I think many commentators have made much of it. For me, it's really very important. Actually, someone I have found recently who does make something of it is a legal scholar named Lockley, in his book on the fundamentals of public law. And what he says is that there's a third sort of constraint that, of course, the sovereign can be subject to. And those are what I'll call internal constraints. The sovereign can't be subject to external constraints, it's true, but can be subject to internal constraints. So what are they? Well, those are the constraints, so to speak, that go into the very definition of what it is to be a sovereign. So, for example, I told you, and he's very explicit about it, a sovereign is someone who's in command of the law, who issues the law. But that's an internal constraint. So if someone chooses to rule not by law in any sense at all, then that person ceases to be a sovereign, and it ceases to be a state. That's the history now in the Bodin sort of fiction. He sets up a game which might, let's see. I'm sorry about this. Okay, I hope that's all right. He sets up a game you might call Find the Sovereign. So actually in the, really not riveting reading, I have to tell you, the 6 books of the Commonwealth is a very long book and very tied into the history and the culture of the time. But he basically looks around different commonwealths or states and looks for where's the sovereign to be found. I always think of it, I say to my students, it's like, we call it in Australia the Find Wally game that we all played with our children, or in America, I've learned they call it Find Waldo game, where you've got the array of faces and somewhere in there is Wally and you've got to find him. And he really sets up the Find the Sovereign game, because if there is no sovereign to be found, it isn't really a state. It makes it absolutely definitional of a state that there is a sovereign power in that state. He actually concludes more or less that Denmark is very questionable as whether it should be counted as a state, but in most cases he does find a sovereign in his own efforts. Now he makes that a little bit easy because, and I maybe should have said this earlier, there are 3 kinds of sovereign that he recognizes. One is the individual monarch, and he usually talks with the individual monarch in mind. A second is a committee. So a committee can be the sovereign. In fact, 2 sorts of committee can be sovereign. One is a committee of the elite, and he says that's an aristocracy. And the other committee is a committee of the whole. That means of the whole citizenry. Now, clear exactly who might count as a citizen, maybe that's not entirely inclusive, but it's certainly a very large committee indeed. And he says about when you've got a committee sovereign or a corporate sovereign, it has to operate, and this is an amazing specification because there is nothing that I can find prior to it, Bodin, that would suggest this is a necessity, but he says it has to operate by majority vote. So it's just the majority make up their mind within the committee, and the committee goes along with the majority. And he calls the committee of the whole, he says, I call that a democracy. Now we'll come back to this at the very end, but that is not the meaning that the word democracy had for the Greeks, for example. He's defining democracy as a participatory majoritarian body where all the citizens come together and they all vote by majority, with arrangements to cover ties on what shall be the law on this, that, or the other, or indeed he allows them that also involve themselves in judicial and in executive offices, though they don't have to, the sovereign doesn't have to do that. But the point is that the committee has to operate by majority voting. The people who, in the committee of the whole, in this democracy, they're all subject to the majority voice of the group. So there is still a sovereign in charge, and that sovereign still is above the law and above all others, fits Bodin's definition. Notice that in making majority voting an essential part of it, he introduces another internal constraint that actually does constrain the sovereign, but not externally and so not objectionably. Sovereign only has to be free of enforced, uncontracted, and external constraints. And the internal constraint he's just introduced is majority voting. If the sovereign is going to be sovereign, by definition, the group, has to operate by majority voting. He gives the word democracy to that system, very different from the Greeks, who regarded even Athens, which is a lotocracy, as people call it nowadays. Most decisions made by lot or by groups who are appointed to by lot. The Greeks call that a democracy. Why so? Because in it, ordinary people had a lot of power. That's all they meant by democracy. Josh Ober has written at length on this, and I follow him in saying that. And that's what they meant by democracy. The word really hadn't been in much use in the Middle Ages, or indeed in the Latin world. He reinvents it and gives it a new meaning. Now, of course, it doesn't make democracy all that attractive. First of all, it's very infeasible. And I think he would have not been worried about that because he really didn't want democracy. I think he defines it in such a way that no one's going to really push for it. And he really wants monarchy. Similarly, Hobbes, who takes over Bodin, uses the word democracy for against this. He's also against democracy. But notice that no even progressive thinkers over the following 400 years defend democracy. They all say, well, we don't want democracy because they mean by democracy something like Bodin's democracy, majoritarian rule of this kind. It's only in the early 19th century, actually, where you get a positive use of the word democracy when it comes to mean a representative system, something quite different. Elections involved for sure, but essentially representative. Prior to that, and you find that in the Federalist Papers in America, but you find it all over, there's deep-seated rejection of what they call democracy. Some contemporary scholars seem to think that people prior to the 19th century were very anti-democratic, pushing for elitism. Well, they may have been in many ways, but it was the word democracy. I think they're not recognizing the word had a very special meaning post-Bodin. The one person who comes close to defending democracy in his sense is, of course, the third of the sovereigntists, Rousseau, because he thinks that, and he admits it's only possible in a small state, but a state like Geneva, his own native Geneva, where the citizens can take majority voting and be their own sovereign, where each individual is subject to the majority voice. But note, he himself insists this is not democracy because he wants to put constraints on his assembly that makes it somewhat different from Hobbes's or Bodin's. For Hobbes and Bodin, it was possible for the sovereign to get involved in judgment and in the execution of laws and executive, administrative decisions. For Rousseau, his assembly should be purely concerned with general laws. So for that reason, he calls it a republic. Actually, a very bad name. I don't think it's really faithful to the older Roman meaning of republican. But here's the picture we have then. We have a group of people who believe that the law is always the issue of commands by a single sovereign, be it an individual or a corporate sovereign, where that position of commander or a sovereign means that that individual or body has absolute power in the sense of not being constrained by enforceable constraints, by external constraints, or by uncontracted constraints. They're all, as you might say, monocentrist. They all think there ought to be a monos, a single center of legal power, outside the law, creating the law. They were deeply opposed to what I used the word for earlier. I'd like to see it. I think it serves our purpose as well, a polycentric regime, where there are mini centers, where you get the courts as well as parliament, the possibility of the courts checking parliament, where you get parliament divided into two chambers, the possibility of one chamber checking another, the possibility of an executive, say as is true still in America today, like the president, checking what the legislative houses do. They call this, in the other tradition that Bodin is resisting, which had a very heavy presence in the medieval world, a republican tradition after a republican Rome. Because Rome was a republic in the sense of having a polycentric regime. You had two bodies, either of which could pass laws, either of which was involved in electing officials. The officials had to come from a noble class, so to speak, and they were members of the Senate. When a law was passed, it had to be proposed by someone from the elite, from the Senate in office, but it had to be passed by one of the popular assemblies. So power in Rome was divided out into different centers. Checks and balances was actually the word that the great sort of commentator on Roman republicanism in the 1st century BCE, Polybius, Greek, but who lived in Rome, came originally as a hostage, he says to the Romans, you've got it made, this is the best thing. And he uses an old Greek phrase, a mixed constitution. I'm calling a polycentric constitution. Bodin wants to resist that completely. And the one thing, well, one of many things that the sovereigntists all agree on is that the polycentric regime, the mixed constitution, is a recipe for anarchy and disaster. Remember, I said that Bodin was writing 4 years after the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Equally, Hobbes was writing really in the middle, or just after, in the case of Leviathan, the English Civil War. They both were very worried about these divisions in society. They thought having a government in which different bodies checked one another, a polycentric government, many different centers of power interacting, mutually checking and balancing one another. They thought of that as anathema, an absolute recipe for anarchy in these difficult times. You need a single sovereign. Hobbes and Bodin do not want democracy or aristocracy. They want the monarchy, because I think that's the only feasible. Descartes is the odd one, not Descartes. Rousseau is the odd one out in looking for the assembly. Okay, that's the background. Now, moving on to the second section. The interesting thing is that while therefore polycentrism could not work in theory, according to these people, the damnable thing was it seemed to work very well in practice. Because, of course, polycentrism, the mixed constitution, was basically exemplified by what was happening in 18th century Britain in particular. So, for example, Montesquieu, who visits Britain in the 1730s, 20s and 30s, does for the British actually what Polybius had done for the Romans. Polybius told the Romans, you're really wonderful, you've got it made, the best constitution in the world. Similarly, Montesquieu comes in the 1720s and 30s and tells the British, this is fantastic. You've got it made. We know the phrase that comes from him, the separation of powers, but it's much more than just the separation of powers, functional separation of powers. It's checks and balances, and the word checks occurs in Montesquieu a lot. Different centers that check and balance one another. Blackstone writes his commentaries on the laws of England in the 1750s, multiply, of course, reprinted, incredibly influential book. In it, he talks about the British Constitution, which is the word he uses, having three distinct powers that check and balance one another. He thinks of them as the King, the Commons, and the Lords, that they are quite separate and they check, and it's a mixed constitution, where he doesn't use that word. It's a polycentrism in practice. But of course, now with the original notion of sovereignty, you have to have a single agent who's in charge of the law, making and unmaking law, the single individual or the corporate body. And here are these people loading a system in which there are many different centers of power. It's exactly the opposite, really, to the sovereigntist way of thinking. They don't comment very much on it. Well, certainly Blackstone doesn't. And he uses the word, more than Montesquieu, the word sovereignty. He talks about sovereignty of these three powers, dividing up sovereignty quite happily. So he takes over the word from Bodin and Hobbes and indeed Rousseau, but he does not take over the concept. I shouldn't have said Rousseau since he wrote before Rousseau, but in any case, he takes the word, but not the concept. Now, I think it's very interesting that later in the 19th century, two theorists in particular, John Austin and A.V. Dicey, both of whom are probably better known to many people in this audience than they are to me. I mean, I'm as it were, a newcomer to some of this literature. They basically try to resurrect the notion of sovereignty, but giving it some or other the oomph of the sovereign, as in the Bodinian and Hobbesian sort of view. And so, for example, Austin, writing earlier in the 19th century, talks about the sovereign in Britain being Parliament. What it means by Parliament is actually the King, the Commons, and the Lords. And he actually says about the Commons, that even the House of the Commons, that really they're just trustees for the people. So he insists on Parliament is sovereign. He doesn't really address the issue. Well, wait a moment, you're talking about a number of bodies checking and balancing one another here, not a single body a la Bodin. Now, Dicey is very similar, it seems to me. Dicey also makes clear Parliament is these three bodies, but then he makes Parliament, or what he comes to call the legal sovereign, meaning the supreme, whatever Parliament says, determines what the law is. That is to say, what the courts will actually recognize as law. But he takes Parliament in that sense to be supreme, even though there is a role given to the courts that actually is, is not grudgingly admitted, because in a way that's a share in sovereignty. However, he wants to insist yes, there is a legal sovereign. But more than that, and this is a new distinction, that's the legal sovereign within the legal system who has the last say on what is the law. But he says there's a political sovereign as well, someone outside the legal system who can determine who the legal sovereign is. And that, of course, he says, is the electorate. Now, this is, it seems to me, an amazing sort of development, really, that Austin and Dicey are wanting to hold on to the notion of sovereignty. And apparently, with the original sort of sense of what a sovereign is, they talk about the sovereign a lot, where, for example, in Blackstone, the sovereign is just a way of referring sometimes to the monarch. But they talk about the sovereign power in the land, very much as if it's a single agent, when manifestly it's not. I mean, the problems with the Austin-Dicey view, as you might put it this way, seem to be two. One is Parliament is not a single agent. So what law emerges is due to a sort of play of forces with no one in control. Will they agree? Won't they agree? Will it pass muster in this way or that? Will the king give his okay, or will the king say no? And then if you run the gauntlet of these bodies, something becomes successfully, something becomes the law thereby. But it's not a single body. It's not a sovereign in the original proper sense. The other thing is with Dicey, and indeed it's also relevant to Austin, when it comes to the political sovereign, they amazingly seem to be utterly insensitive. I'm sorry to criticize legal theorists in such company, but Dicey seems to be completely insensitive to the fact that what happens to be voted up, in an election doesn't make the electorate into an agent, that can hire or fire, so to speak, and dictate what happens in government. He doesn't seem to recognize, for example, that, well, in fairness, that's something that's only become more obvious in the 20th century, that any voting system, majoritarian voting above all, and that was a problem for the original sovereigntists too, but I'm not going to address it, that any voting system can produce quite different results with the same votes going in if you've got different electoral rules. I mean, as we know, for example, think about the recent US presidential election. Had boundaries been drawn in different ways, you'd have a very different Congress. You might have had a different president if boundaries were drawn in different ways. Dicey seems to ignore that fact that, the rules under which an election is conducted play as big a role as the individual votes of individuals voting in determining what the outcome is. And for that reason, you can't regard the electorate as being an agent that might play a sovereign role. But he actually says, I think I quote that in the handout, he talks about under an electoral system that we now have no distinction between how does he put it? The will of the nation will be, will be the same as the will of the sovereign. Interesting phrase, the will of the nation. Actually, that first appears in the 1791 Constitution of the French Republic. Long and interesting history about how it appears there, coming out of Rousseau, ultimately. But the sovereignty of the nation begins to appear very dominantly in this period. This now, according to Dicey, just is the same as the sovereign will. But this is fanciful. There is no agent there. You know, the electorate are really, you can get in it, put the same thing in, change the rules, you can get anything out. To say that's the electorate as a single agent, that's their will, is just, it seems to me, is deeply misleading, if not mystifying. So I think in response to the Austen-Dicey thing, what happened in the 20th century, for example, of course, the US, very much like Britain, actually introduces explicitly a checks and balances type government and explicitly refers back to the Roman authors of this idea. You know, so Publius is the author, I mean, a pseudonym of the Federalist Papers. They all are very conscious. They use Blackstone, they use Montesquieu, of course, of that tradition, and they set themselves against the notion of there being a single sovereign, and it seems to work. So should we just give up on the notion of sovereignty? We've got the US throwing it out, more or less. I mean, it survives in talking about sovereign states within the federation, but that's really just a sop, I think, to the states, frankly, nothing more than that. Should we just give it up? And, you know, these English theorists seem to me to be playing fast and loose, as it were, at the idea. And it was given up by someone like Hart, probably the premier legal theorist of the 20th century in England. His concept of law in 1962 basically is an assault. It begins with an assault on Austen and on the notion that there is a single sovereign power behind the law. And he puts in place a very different view, that the law is due to, well, first of all, any community he thinks will generate some social norms by which people live in dealing with one another, norms of nonviolence, norms of truthfulness, non-deception, non-manipulation, non-theft, and so on. He thinks any society is going to generate those sorts of norms. He calls them primary rules. And he thinks you get, so to speak, norms elevated to the status of laws insofar as you equally get a second set of norms. He calls them secondary rules, whereby someone individual or some procedure is identified as the way in which you identify a norm as a law, and you get norms emerging whereby it's determined whether or not a given primary rule, a given norm, now a law, has been broken or not, and how it should be judged. But he thinks these conventions just bubble up. There isn't any one figure, the sovereign, behind the law. He becomes an utter skeptic. And similarly, on the continental side, someone like Hans Kelsen, I think I quote him, talks about we should suppress the very notion of sovereignty. He thinks it's a dangerous notion. And of course, it got a bit associated with the Nazi tradition, which is, I think, part of why Kelsen is pulling back from it. He's a great defender of Weimar, of course. Carl Schmitt, on the other hand, is all for it. Remember, he says, he who can decide the exception is the sovereign. Now, what Schmitt means by sovereign there is just the power in the land. So if the army could march in at any time and take over, even when they don't, they're still going to be sovereign in the sense that they could do that. They have that sort of power. But that's a wholly different notion of sovereign. It's not the idea of an internally constrained sovereign of the kind that Bodin introduced. Okay, so I now want to ask the question, moving on to the third section. Well, should we give up on the notion of sovereignty? Should we follow people like Hart and so on and Kelsen and just throw it out? I think that would be a real mistake. I think it'd be a mistake actually philosophically, but putting that aside, I think it'd be a deep mistake from my point of view, politically and rhetorically, because it would be basically to give the term, and it has become a sort of sacred term invoked on all sides, to the electoralists, as I call them, to the populists. It would be to say that, look, we have constitutional democracies, there's no sovereign, it's just law bubbling up and being adjudicated by the courts, and checking and balancing by different bodies within the parliament or between parliament and the courts or whatever. It would be to say we don't have sovereignty, we just have that sort of system. And then to give the idea of a popular sovereign to electoralists who say the sovereign is the one who's elected by the people, the party that's elected, if elected, of course, or the individual who's the leader of the party. And, you know, we're very familiar with that way of thinking in autocratic democratic practice today in countries like Hungary, perhaps Poland, certainly Erdogan's Turkey, Putin's Russia, perhaps Modi's India. They're certainly pushing very much in this direction, so that I think we should not give over the notion that easily, because it's going to be used, so to speak, giving a weapon to a side I think is deeply misguided in its thinking about politics. But how do we save the notion of sovereignty? Save it in the original sense, and yet make it consistent with a constitutional democracy rather than a purely electoral democracy. Well, let me tell you a story, a little break, so to speak, in the development at this point. Gilbert Ryle, very famous Oxford philosopher, as many of you know, philosopher of mind, in his book, The Concept of Mind, he tells the following story. Sure, it's a common yarn, so to speak, in the Oxford common rooms of his time, of the visitor who comes to Oxford and asks by a local to be shown around. And the local takes him, you know, to All Souls and to Pembroke and Magdalen, shows him all the colleges. And, you know, he thinks he's done his job, he's shown him around Oxford. And the visitor says, well, that's great. Now, I've seen all the colleges, but can you show me the university? And of course, he's making, well, what Ryle himself called a category mistake, because he's imagining that the university is coordinate with the colleges. There are the, whatever there were, 30 colleges, say, at the time, and then the university side by side with them. Well, we know that is a sort of a howler, you know, because anyone who knows how Oxford or any Oxbridge, or indeed any university is constructed, many at least, is going to recognize that the university, say, let's stick with Oxford, is superordinate to the colleges. The university is an agent, all right, does various things. The university is the one who admits students. The university is the one that recognizes teachers. The university is the one that sets exams. The university is the one that identifies the examiners. The university is the one that sets the relevant standards. The university is the one that actually confers degrees in the end. You do not get a BA or whatever from Magdalen College, you get it from the University of Oxford. But it operates, certainly in Ryle's time, very well operated by virtue of agreements between the colleges. They all play different roles in admitting students, but they admit students on behalf of the university. They set exams on behalf of the university. Members of the college act in a dual role. So the university emerges as an agent from, as you might call them, sub-agents, these individual colleges. In looking for the university after seeing the colleges, but actually the university, that supposed visitor is committing is a fallacy that A.N. Whitehead, the English-American philosopher of the early 20th century, described as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. They're imagining, visitor, that the university is something as concrete as the colleges, and they're looking for something concrete like that. Now, the very interesting thing is that Bodin's Find the Sovereign game, which I think actually still goes on in some ways, is always look for the body within the state that is the sovereign body. So, for example, I can point you to a recent, very distinguished Greek historian who asked the question, which body is sovereign within Athens? You know, and he looks at the courts and looks at the boule, the council, and looks at the ecclesia, the assembly, looks at all of these bodies and asks, is this the sovereign? Where's the sovereign? You know, to find Wally. And actually really fails to find the sovereign and comes up with the view that really Athens is more like a mixed constitution, no sovereign. But I think that's really quite a bad mistake, because just as the university can be an agent that exists through the colleges, so the state, maybe better called the polity, can be an agent that operates via the courts, via the parliament, via the statutory bodies, via the electorate, via the bodies that are entitled to contest judgments, for example, via bodies that are authorized in various ways, like a citizens' assembly in some jurisdictions nowadays. And these bodies together, like the colleges in Oxford, they authorize one another and agree on certain procedures in such a way that you get an emerging entity, like the university, the state, or the polity. And it's the polity that has relations with other states. It's the polity that ultimately passes laws. It's the polity that changes its even fundamental laws in referenda. It's the polity that via the courts now interprets the laws in various ways. It's the polity that proposes the laws in the parliament and so on. You can think of all of these as agents, sub-agencies of this single overarching emerging entity. There's no sort of magic here. This isn't, it's nothing over and above the constituent parts in one sense, but in another sense it is. And of course, the emerging entity, the polity or the state, I'm now going to suggest to you, can also be a sovereign in exactly Bodin's sense. In fact, in Hobbes' sense, or even in Rousseau's sense. Because the state considered as an entity that is at the basis of the law, the state as that sort of entity satisfies the criteria of being the source of law or the commander, the sovereign that issues laws, operating through very different procedures and the many different ways in which a law can get to be established by referenda, by parliament, by the courts interpreting an existing law in a certain way. The state is the one that issues the laws. The state is actually is the one and only sovereign. It's not as if it acknowledges any opposing source of law within its territory, at least its jurisdiction. The state is, of course, above individual agents, or indeed these sub-agencies I'm talking about. It is supreme in that sense. And the state is equally above the law itself, because I'm talking about domestic sovereignty. I should have said this earlier. International sovereignty, it's a closely related topic. There are things that might come up in discussion about it, but that is not my topic today. It's really domestic sovereignty. And the state is above its own laws in the sense that it can change any of those laws. Now you might say, what about a constitution? Doesn't it bind the state? Well, no, because the state, in the sense I'm thinking about it, the state can change the constitution. Of course, there are procedures whereby it does that by, for example, putting a constitutional issue up for amendment in a referendum, where there are rules governing the referendum, different rules in different states, but it's still the state. It can change its own law in that way. So the state is really a perfect exemplar of a sovereign. Now you might say, well, wait a moment though, it's not really a sovereign, is it? Because it's constrained. You just said there's a constitution and it has to operate by the constitution. In America, for example, by using Article 5 of the Constitution, by following it and changing any other articles in the Constitution. So even when it changes its fundamental laws, it's got to go via the fundamental laws as they are at that point. You might say, doesn't this constrain the state? Well, what I would say, it constrains the sub-agencies within the state, but it's an internal constraint, a constitutive constraint, a definitional constraint from the point of view of the sovereign state as a whole. For Bodin, for Hobbes, for all of these people, majority voting was the one and only way that a sovereign body could operate, a corporate sovereign body could operate. Well, similarly, in an existing state, there's an internal constraint, which is the constitution, of course, but it is internal. It's what defines, it gives life to the state. The state doesn't exist except independently of that constitution. It's not an external constraint from the outside. So I suggest to you the state, even in a polycentric regime, or indeed in a monocentric regime, the state can always, in that abstract sense, roughly, be regarded as the ultimate sovereign. But let me come to my conclusion. We wanted to talk about popular sovereignty. So the question is, If you agree that the state can be the sovereign in the original sovereigntist sense, even in a polycentric regime, something that they didn't recognize, if you agree with that, does that make the people the sovereign? And of course, the answer is clearly it doesn't. That's not enough. A state that is very undemocratic, a state that is governed by a single party, for example, where the party, just selects its own members by its own procedures, such a state is certainly not a democracy. And in such a state, the party is the sovereign, the people are not the sovereign. So what are we required to make the people the sovereign? Well, think about the notion of a club, or indeed think about the notion of a college. Those of you who know an Oxbridge College, we can think of the club as an entity that makes decisions. The club is the one that decides to sell land. The club is the one that decides on the conditions of membership. The club is the one that decides on its constitution, and it can change its constitution and so on. Or similarly, the college can do it in the university case. But sometimes, with some clubs, we're quite happy to describe the club as the membership. To say, well, the membership have decided that henceforth we're not going to do this or that, that henceforth we're going to be constrained in this or that way. The membership, say, has decided to sell a property, this in the club case, that it had owned previously. We'll talk about the membership of the club as if they're the same. But we'll only do that if the members basically control the club, if the power in the club is shared between the members of the club. If, for example, the club is really utterly controlled by a group of old cronies, whatever. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. If it's controlled by an elite within the club, it would be a misnomer to say that the membership made a decision. No, the club made a decision, sure, but it was the elite club that made the decision. You can't identify the club with the membership. You can only if power is relatively equally distributed among the membership. Actually, the medievals is a very striking thing. Now, many people have pointed it out, but the word civitas in Republican writers, actually back in Roman times too, but in the medievals in particular, the word civitas is the word that we normally now translate as the state or the polity, standard Latin translation. But civitas also meant the citizenry. And in a republic, as people would have thought of it, say, in Renaissance Florence, or in other city republics of the time, they would have thought of the citizenry as being the state, because the power of the state was distributed fairly well amongst the citizenry. Now, what I want to suggest to you is the people are sovereign only if the power is distributed fairly equally amongst the people in the state. Only if, so to speak, the word the state and the people can co-refer in the way the club and the membership, those terms, can co-refer in the case of a club where power is distributed more or less equally. So that suggests that if we have a state where power is distributed equally amongst the people, we can say the people are sovereign in this perfectly good sense. In traditional, legally appropriate, it seems to be philosophically quite sharp sense, the people are sovereign. So the question now is, well, how about the electoralists versus the constitutional Democrats? The electoral Democrat says, well, the best way of sharing power amongst the people equally is to have majority voting on issue by issue. That, of course, may not work in any case, but I'm putting aside that problem here. But of course, we all know that having majority voice decide everything within the state is almost certainly going to mean, under any real world circumstances, that a lot of people are systematically denied power. Those that belong to sticky minorities, as you might say, religious minorities or whatever other sorts of minorities, they're always going to be in the minority. They're not going to have the protection of immunity against what the state can do that others have. They're not going to have influence over what the state does and the way those in the majority can do. It's the old problem, Republican phrase, of electoral despotism. Madison uses it in the Federalist Papers. the tyranny of the majority, as I think Jefferson called it. And that's not sharing power equally. So ironically, it seems to me, if you had an electoral democracy, you would absolutely not have the people being sovereign, not in the sense that we now have given to that notion, whereas the state is sovereign and the people are sovereign if power is distributed well enough amongst the people. On the other hand, look at constitutional democracies. Now, they're certainly not perfect, but I think the notion of constitutional democracy, it involves many elements. Some of them to mind, the notion of a constitution that can be changed in various ways, but under various conditions. The notion of domain general authorities, mainly legislative, who are elected by the people. The notion of an independent judiciary who can judge on whether or not a law has been broken and interpret the laws so as to, so far as possible, make the body of law consistent, coherent, if there are problems in that case. The idea of there being statutory authorities, maybe ombudsmen or whatever, that can act in the name of people who we appeal to against the government. The idea of individual people having certain immunities against what the government can do to them. The idea in particular of people being able to contest what government is doing, of course at election time, but equally contest in the press, on the streets, in the media, without fear of suppression. Think of all of those sorts of instruments and think of them being multiplied by, for example, the use of citizens' assemblies, which seems to be a great new device of democratic theory. And if you've got power spread out in that way, of course, you're going to have differences of wealth and influence and all sorts of things, but it seems to me you'll get at least close enough to the idea of the members sharing equally in power for it to be described as a constitutional democracy, properly speaking, in the Greek sense of power being spread equally among the people fairly well. And when you have that, ironically, and only when you have that, do you have the people collective being the sovereign, so to speak. You can think of the state as the people. So ironically, it seems to be the electoralists, so to speak, they lose the game, except they invent a new concept of sovereignty. In terms of the old notion, you only make the people sovereign by virtue of a constitutional democracy. Let me just finish with this comment, which is, I think we're often misled by the notion of the people. And when we talk about the people being in control in a democracy, because that suggests the people in the collective sense. And that often sounds like the people when they go to the polls and elect. And I think that feeds into the electoralist notion of democracy, that the people collective, so to speak, are in control. But in a democracy proper, it seems to me what's important is that it's the people several, as you might say, the people considered as individuals being in control. That's what's central to a democracy. And ironically, it's only when you give the people several, fairly equal power, equal access to influence and so on, that the people collective are actually going to be the sovereign. Is the notion of popular sovereignty the, as it were, the hard test for whether you've got a democracy or not? I think not, actually. I think that the people collective, people in that sense, as the state, the people operating as the state, they become sovereign when you've got a democracy. But it's not the fact that the people collective have that sovereign status that makes it a democracy. What makes it a democracy, the real essence of democracy, is that the people several share fairly equally in power. I better stop at that point. Thank you very much.
All right, so thank you, Philip. That was tremendous. We've got some time for questions. So if you're in the room, you can raise your hand in the usual way. And if you're joining us online, then please use the Q&A function and I can read your question out. Professor Krieger.
Everything you said, except where you started by colliding electoralism with populism. And I think that populist, ones in the countries you mentioned, Poland, Hungary, Philippines, Turkey, etc., are making a new, and I couldn't hear you respond to it. So the electoralism, polyarchy or polycentrism contrast, the majoritarian difficulty, as it used to be called, is a kind of standard issue between liberals and Democrats, if you want to say. It's been around for a very long time. And you're saying, well, the electorate pretend or believe that they're giving people the vote, or people individually vote, they only give some. That, in a sense, is the starting point, it seems to me, of the new populist critique. And that is that in the United States, in post-communist countries, there's systematically been a differentiation between the elites, the corrupt, wealthy, and educated, and the people. And here the people is not anymore pretending to be the whole. It is the screw. It's the part of the whole which is Nadia's new book, Me the People. It's clever. So they're not claiming to represent everybody in the country. On the contrary, the other people don't count. Trump says that, Kaczynski says that, Orban says that. And for these people, they're saying what you're saying. So-called constitutional democracy is consistent with and is part of a package where the real people are systematically disenfranchised, not legally, but socially, economically, in other ways. And the new populism is pretending to be the voice of the suffering people against the exploitative elites and so on. And that's a completely different story. And I know you have a response to it because you have a response to everything, but what is the response to that? Because it seems that's a major, major modern challenge.
I think it's just another reading of the same sort of basic frame that I had. So I agree that in these, and I like the phrase, I call it myself neo-populism in general, because of course there were populists and there are populists who are not electoralists in the sense I'm now talking about. And I agree that among the new populists or the electoralists, if we can call them that, there's a strong tendency to say, not only is it the people who vote who are in control, but those who don't vote for the right leaders are not the real people. So there's very much that sort of, that's xenophobic as well as anti-elitist, by the way, as we both know. So that's an extra move in the game, but it's, so to speak, it's not even remotely defensible move. It's a move that does occur. I absolutely agree. I also agree that when people do say, well, the thing about those who vote, maybe count as the real people, or those they vote for at any rate, they see those who occupy these roles I talked about, lead social movements, who hold positions in the courts, who have statutory offices, for example. They see those people as an elite versus us, the ordinary people. That is, it seems to me, maybe it's inescapable sociologically, but it's an incidental divide between those in different parts of a constitutional democracy. I mean, and I think you and I will agree with this, that if you've got a functioning democracy, you have to have courts. They have to be independent. You have to have a constitution. I would say you have to have social movements, that will actually play a role in mobilizing public opinion. You have to have freedom of information. You have to have independent press, or at least a very diverse press and media. You have to have a whole range of things like that. It's a sort of sociological accident that those who get drawn into a lot of those jobs are going to be, in educational and class terms, something of an elite. There's no doubt at all about that. And we should think about how we can put that right. And I think you've got to go right back to the educational system, putting it right. But I think the electoralists, they make use of that incidental difference to say, we're the real people, not the minorities who invaded us, not the elite. We, the ordinary schmucks, so to speak, who vote, are the real people. But it seems to me just, it's a rhetorical twist on the same frame that I'm describing. I won't say any more, Martin, at this point, because there are others.
So I'm just going to read out a question from someone on Zoom. It's a certain Wojciech Sadurski.
Indeed, yes. Hi, Wojciech.
Who starts by apologising for not being able to be here in person. And he says, can you distinguish as neatly as you suggested by the end of your presentation between domestic and international sovereignty? After all, the very concept of sovereignty these days is under challenge, not only from the electoralist conceptions, but also from the reality of supranational authorities which make peremptory norms and which are not derivable from state consent. So perhaps this is an extra reason for deeming sovereignty redundant or obsolete.
Making it redundant?
Yes.
Okay, so I actually think that, but I didn't say this in the talk, obviously, but that the notion of treating the state as a superordinate, so to speak, sovereign, in any system, really, but in particular the popular superordinate sovereign in a democracy, I think that goes well with thinking of states as being sovereigns that relate to one another in the international arena. Now, before you, as it were, cry out at that description, let me just draw an analogy. We think of ourselves as individuals, as sovereign individuals in a proper democracy, in a proper legal system. But of course, we recognize that what freedoms we each have got to be freedoms such that we can each enjoy them consistently with the public good, consistently, if you like, with everybody enjoying them properly. So we define basic liberties that we sovereign citizens should each enjoy. We define them as being limited in such a way that they don't create a world in which we're all worse off rather than better off. Many of us think, for example, that the freedom to own a gun is a freedom that it's not sensible that individual citizens should have. For example, in Australia, that's standard. America takes a different view, as we know, and that's due to tradition and so on. Without, as we're criticizing, I just want to say in defense of Australia, that I think most of us will think that it's perfectly right that our individual liberties should be circumscribed so as not to include the liberty to own a gun. Now, I think in the same way, if you think of sovereign states in the international world, and we recognize we only got one planet, and we recognize that there are all sorts of problems that we generate as public bads, global bads, of course in conflict above all else, but equally we now know in the externalities of destroying the air, basically, and the earth we live on, we recognize that we have to limit the liberties, so to speak, of each sovereign state. And I think if you start from the notion of sovereignty, you then get to the notion of what are the liberties that sovereign states should enjoy by looking at what are the liberties that are consistent with the global good, so to speak. As we think most of it in every society, that basic liberty should be limited by the local good of that society.
Thank you, Philip. Those of us in the room will have a chance to speak to you afterwards. So I'm going to take one more question, and it's from Max Delmar, who is in London. So Max says, thank you for your interesting talk. I do not think it follows that sacrificing the idea of sovereignty means accepting what you called electoralism. This dichotomy is a false one. Rather, there is plenty of space in between these two extremes. One example of that might be the tradition of common law constitutionalism, a tradition that includes Coke, Hume, Burke, and others, possibly Hart. This is a vision of law that does not require a commander, that is not decisionist, but instead recognizes a very different picture of law and also reason, a social, conventional, historical picture. This involves constructing a rich normative account of custom and customary reason. How would you assess this tradition, the common law constitutionalist tradition, or at least the prospect for this middle space between sovereigntism and electorism?
Well, I would say that I'm a great enthusiast about Hart on the theory of law, actually. I do think that that's a very good explanation of how law emerges and changes and so on, entirely with Hart and a whole range of questions there. I just think that you don't have to give up on the notion of sovereignty just because you adopt that view of law. Consistently with that view of law, you have to recognize that there is a state that is an agent and that these sub-agencies, Parliament, the courts, the statutory authorities, they all act in the name of the state. And that isn't empty rhetoric. There really is an entity there that is required to display consistency, for example, over time, so that there's a reasonable complaint if the state is defending inconsistent sets of views, for example. So I think that having the view that he describes is not inconsistent with recognizing sovereignty. And it's not inconsistent in particular if it's a polycentric regime that distributes power equally or relatively equally amongst people. Ordinary people, as well as, so to speak, the elites in various ways, it's consistent with saying that the people are sovereign. You could do without the notion of popular sovereignty. I mean, in my own writing, for example, I certainly worked without it more in Hartian type terms. But I do think rhetorically, it's not a good idea to, as it were, hand over the notion of popular sovereignty to the electoralists or the neo-populists, whatever you call them, because it's a very powerful phrase that rings and it plays into the game of saying, oh, these constitutional democrats, they're really just constitutionalists. The democracy means nothing. And it leads in that direction. And I just think that that is politically a very bad direction to take. I want to say, you know, they talk about claim back your government. I want to say claim back your popular sovereignty. I mean, let's not let it go from this constitutional image of democracy itself.
Thank you, Philip. Between 1942 and 1972, Julius Stone gave many talks on national radio. His talks are being edited by his children, Jonathan, Eleanor, and Michael, and published by Sydney University Press. Professor Pettit, on behalf of Julius Stone's family, I'd like to present you with a couple of volumes of Julius Stone's talks to thank you for delivering the address.
I am deeply grateful, in particular, delighted to be associated with the name of Julius Stone, who, as I said, is surely the towering figure in legal theory in Australia, going way back.
Thank you, Philip.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Before we finish, I'd just like to thank Simran Singh, Andrew Netherington, and our student volunteers who have helped us with this evening's event. I'd like to thank you for joining us online and in person. Most of all, however, I'd like to thank once again Philip Pettit for his fabulous lecture. Thank you.